My name is Laura. I have the great privilege of being both a member here and someone who was one of many back then, who was encouraged by this church to follow a call to ministry. And for me, that's been in interfaith work. Currently, I lead a program called Food for Thought. It's an interfaith dialogue program on CSU campus. We gather students from all faith traditions, no faith traditions, and not really sure. And we practice getting to know one another. We practice having hard conversations. We practice talking about spirituality and religion without proselytizing or trying to change anyone's mind. We have built powerful relationships across religious difference in what I'm pretty sure is the most religiously diverse room on campus. It's an honor to walk with the students I work with. And it's deeply affected my own spirituality. And it's part of what I have to talk about today, which is Christian anti-Judaism. And I feel like we need to have the high school groan of all the teenagers. Because it's Epiphany and it's the end of the Christmas season and there's all this sentimentality that I love too. But also the threads of anti-Judaism that come all over Christianity start in the birth story. They're there too. And they're there here in how we talk about Herod and the Jewish leadership in Jerusalem. I did a better paraphrasing right now than what I wrote down. So please hold. The Jewish students I work with on campus, almost every single one of them will tell us that they don't share that they are Jewish on campus, except at Food for Thought or in spaces that are explicitly for Jewish students. And I say that by way of example, that even in a place where we think of as really supportive of interfaith relationships, Jewish young people do not feel safe enough to be open about who they are, which is another reason why I say we have to talk about it, even at Epiphany. Herod and the Jewish leadership in Jerusalem are set out as villains. And our Epiphany texts conveniently cut out some of the really haunting things they do that follow in the text to come. And our heroes are set up as the wise ones or Mary, protecting the child. But I think what Herod and the Jewish leaders were doing is entirely fair. And I'll share with you why. But first I have to look and see if Reverend Dr. David Peterson is in the audience, because we have a number of retired biblical scholars in our congregation. And I'm going to give you the 5-minute version, which is going to make some people twitch. So my apologies to all the biblical scholars who have spent their lives studying something I'm going to give us in about 5 minutes if I'm doing well. Because I think knowing the context in which our biblical texts were written, especially the New Testament, helps us understand why the anti-Judaism is there and hopefully gives us reasons and tools to not repeat those mistakes. So, from this text, we might think of Herod as this independent king running an independent kingdom, but it really wasn't true at all. Herod was more of a puppet king. Rome had conquered everything. All of Israel, most of its neighbors. And Rome found Israel especially inconvenient as a colonized nation because of its religion. When Rome conquered, they would happily, multi-religiously welcome all the gods into their pantheon, into the city. Shrines would get built, everyone would be welcome. But the flip side of that was that all colonized folks would have to pay taxes to the emperor, but the emperor was a god, and so taxes were sacrifices, which means that in Israel that could not happen because of the god that was being worshipped there, demanded no other sacrifices be made to any other gods. So Rome had to find new ways to accommodate Judaism and the Israelites. And then many Roman citizens were attracted to Judaism, were attracted to many of the things I admire in the Jewish tradition, and they converted. And because of that, Jews were actually expelled from the city of Rome 3 times. And meanwhile, back in Judea, Jewish leadership again and again kept revolting until 70 CE, when Rome had it, invaded, destroyed the temple and the city, and carried off all of the treasures back to Rome. So the time that we're talking about with Herod and with Jesus being born is about 70 years before that. But even then, Rome is tolerating Israel only just enough. It's a very dangerous feeling time. And so I like to have some empathy for these leaders who heard of a potential revolution and became afraid. And became afraid of what would happen, maybe for them because also they had power. And yes, power makes us often want to keep it. But also afraid because of what Rome would do if they found out. And I can say there are plenty of things I have done because I've been afraid of what would happen and how other people would respond. And so I can have some more empathy for the kind of fear and suspicion that happened. But also, our story wasn't written back in 70 CE, or in 0 CE. Most likely these stories were written down 100 to 150 years later. So the temple's been destroyed, but also Christianity has been separated from Judaism. And I cannot emphasize enough the kind of trauma and terror this began. Because while Judaism was tolerated within the Roman Empire, the minute they separated, which is something religions do, they grow, they change, they move on. But by leaving the Jewish tradition, Christianity lost all legal protections. They went from being a barely tolerated subset of a barely tolerated religious tradition to tax-dodging enemies of the state. And so the stories that we have about persecution are in part about this break. It was a horrific trauma. And it was one that is clear from the literature of early Christians that early Christians blamed the Jews for. And in their arguments against persecution and for Christianity, again and again, Christians claim that they are the true heirs of the Jewish tradition. And we see it all over the Christian story. The Star in the East, foreign kings, foreign priests coming to worship Jesus. All of these are messages trying to say that Christianity is the true heir of Judaism. I can't overstate how much harm this has caused. Because not too long later, Christianity became a dominant religion. And that all of these things that were written in trauma, in pain, in fear, became the justification for anti-Jewish expulsion, violence, and prejudice on through the centuries. It's like our ancestors of faith just keep recreating the trauma instead of doing anything to change a narrative, to approach others with hospitality and loving kindness. And after 2020, my church family, to say nothing of all the other traumas that come in day out in our families, in our church community, and in our world, we know something of trauma. We know something of fear. And as we've moved out of some of the most harrowing parts of the pandemic, I believe we also know something of facing how we coped with trauma in the worst of it and seeing that it's not serving us any longer. I know there are times when I spoke out of rage at people who I disagreed with. I know that in my body, I still feel more fear and anger about people I disagree with than I did before. I'm using I statements, and I'm not going to make any assumptions about we, which is another rule we have at Food for Thought. I would really hate for either of those reactions that come from trauma to be the legacy that anyone took from my life. When I'm giving the gospel writers and compilers all the credit I can, I hope that's true for them too. That they regret the pieces that have come through and caused harm. So, to change the legacy we leave, we need to change how we behave in the midst of fear and trauma and change. I'll be honest, I've had a hard time finding the how-to steps of that from within the biblical text. But one of the resources that has helped me is what I had us start with this morning. This settling exercise is from a type of trauma recovery called somatic experiencing, or the community resiliency model. And one of the things that they say is we can't think our way out of bad habits or bad behaviors or pain. We can't think our way out of it. We have to bring our bodies with us. Because even if we're trying to think differently and to behave differently with our brains, our bodies, getting nervous, getting angry, will cause us to do other things. And so we need to help our bodies learn to settle in times of hardship. This is a set of techniques that I use at Food for Thought, both to stay grounded in myself as a facilitator, but also to help the students from so many religious traditions and traditions that are in conflict with each other. For some traditions that negate somebody else's identity, to help them sit in a room with each other, we have to have settled bodies. I didn't write this part down. So I'll say I can tell in the time of change in our community, I can feel how my body is tighter than it used to be in this room. Which is why I want us to take a minute and settle and look for the doors and windows to remind ourselves that we are safe in this room, even when it feels hard. Something that I love about this tradition of somatic experiencing is they talk that humans eating together in a community is a way to calm our bodies down and to connect with each other on a subconscious level, to build trust sort of among our bodies as opposed to among our words. And that's what we're about to do as we move into communion. And to do that, I think I'm going to invite us to settle us again. And maybe this is just for me. But young ones in the playground, if you want to stand up again, or you can keep drawing, because they're my children, they get to do that. So those of us who are seated or standing, go ahead and shift a little. Make sure you know where your body is. See if you can notice what is holding you up, and let it hold you. Let your eyes go again to those meeting places of walls and the ceiling, the entrances and exits. Go ahead and see what's behind you, if that feels right to you. And maybe notice the wonderful people who are behind you. And let us be settled and maybe a little more trusting than we were when we walked in as we prepare our hearts and minds for communion.